Hello, folks. We are live from, let me get rid of that message. We are live from Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts today with Bryan Hebert Jr. at Chris Salmons for the Atlantic Candlepin Singles Tour, Class D North. And this match today is being brought to you from Haverhill, Massachusetts at Academy Lanes. We have Bryan Hebert, the away bowler, challenging Chris Salmons, the home bowler, here on lanes 3 and 4 at Academy Lanes. And without further ado, we are going to kick this off with Bryan Hebert leading off on lane 3. Bryan Hebert coming off of a tournament we just finished at Lakeside Lanes this afternoon, and he is looking to continue his hot streak of over 100 average today. And without further ado, we're going to kick this off. So let's switch over. The bowlers will 5 strings of Candlepin bowling, and this roughly takes about 90 minutes or so, and we will begin without further ado. I will stop saying without further ado. Without further ado, we are good to go. We've given Bryan Hebert Jr. the signal to begin bowling, and we are off to the races, as some might say. Checking this out, Bryan Hebert's opening ball here at Academy Lanes is a 5, 7, 10 split. He took out the head pin, leaving the 5 pin along with the 7-10 split. Very difficult shot to make as Bryan attempts to go for the 5 pin right side, but just narrowly misses it. Don't blame him for missing that. No shame in missing this shot. Bryan takes one more out for an 8-box to start up his match against Chris Salmons. Bryan Hebert, the away bowler, starting today. He is 26-16 for the season against Chris Salmons' 22-20 season thus far. Still in the early days of this year's ACST, but anything is possible. Bryan Hebert averages 100.87 for the season thus far, as Bryan Hebert takes out all but 7, the back 75% of a diamond, 6, 9, and 10 pins. Bryan Hebert Jr., Bryan Hebert Sr. is his father. We'll be bowling with Bryan Hebert Sr. tonight in regular league at Lakeside. Bryan Hebert Jr., meanwhile, going for the 3-ball spare, only gets the 10 pin, leaving the 6 and 9. That is an 8-box for Bryan Hebert Jr. Bryan Hebert Jr., son of Bryan Hebert Sr. You can see why I get them confused. Both are legendary bowlers in their own right. Bryan Hebert Sr., back in the day, was rolling off for, I believe, the Channel 5 show. Just narrowly missed the roll-off by just a few pins. Bryan Hebert Jr. definitely embodies that same spirit as Bryan Hebert Sr., as Bryan just misses the spare shot, leaving only the head pin on lane 3 at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts. My name is Steve Kelly. I'm going to be your commentator, unofficial scoreboard keeper, unofficial anything, unofficial referee. Bryan has taken a 9-box in the 3rd box of the 1st string. Here's the full scoreboard. And Bryan taking lane 3. Misses the head pin wide left, but gets a bit of a spread. Decent leave here. We have the 1, 2, 5, 7, and 10 pins. Decent spare opportunity of hit right, but Bryan misses it left, takes out everything but the head pin. Bryan going for the 10-box. Seems to get stuck on what appears to be a bit of a sticky spot on the lane, or maybe just a bit of a misstep, stutter step. Concludes his 4th box with a 9. 34 after 4 for Bryan Hebert Jr. Please start a count for the amount of times I mistakenly say senior today. I don't know why I'm focusing on that verbally. Bryan just narrowly misses the head pin to the left again. Bit of a common theme. The thing about common themes with this is if we can identify them, perhaps we can learn from them, as Bryan just misses the head pin to the right this time, taking out the 3 and the 6 pins. Going for another 10, hoping to break his streak of 8s and 9s this half so far. Bryan is going to continue the 8 and 9 train, finishing with an 8-box after his 5th, leaving him at 42 and a half in game number 1. And now we have Chris Salmons taking the floor. Also starting off at lane 3 here in Academy Lanes, going for his first ball of the day. Bit of a lofty first ball off to the left, bit of a spin, taking out the 4, 7, 8 pins. Chris Salmons, excellent spare. Wonderful shot by Chris Salmons. Definitely putting the pressure on Bryan. 10 plus after 1 compared to Bryan's 8. Here's where we are at in the score standing so far. Not a whole lot going on just yet. If you're just tuning in, you haven't missed much. You've just witnessed the first mark of the day, completed by Chris Salmons. Chris Salmons on the field takes 6. And I'm going to watch this because I might be excited if this is what I... Watching Chris Salmons' approach, this makes me excited. Chris Salmons has the same goofy bowling approach that I also do, in which, watch his right leg. He releases with his right hand and slides on his right foot, which is precisely the same approach that I do, actually. And a few other bowlers in the community also do it. I believe Ashley Breton also does it with her left hand sliding on her left foot. Most bowlers will release on the foot that is the opposite of their releasing hand. So it's one of those things where it's like seeing a unicorn in the wild. I love to see it when someone bowls sort of like I do. It's kind of validating. As Chris Salmons goes for the spare attempt and just narrowly misses it. 1-8-9 attempt, takes out the 1 and the 8, leaves the 9. Chris Salmons going for the 10 box. Chris Salmons attempting the 10 box. Very pragmatic approach, high lofty ball, releases to the right, 9 box for Chris Salmons. I recognize that ball. So this is cool. So when there's an approach like mine, I can sort of provide some extra insight into why he may be successfully or having issues with releasing the ball, because I totally understand this, having just bowled 5 games myself. I just bowled a 595 myself at Lakeside Lanes for the singles tournament. Bryan Hebert beating me by 1 in the total handicap for the day, 691 to 690, as Chris Salmons gets a field goal on the 4 and 6 pins. I can't give him 3 pins for that, unfortunately, so sorry about that, Chris. Hopefully you can get 9, though. Look at that, 9. 9 is greater than 3. Chris Salmons after his 4th box, 9 for 42 after 4. Take a quick look at the scoreboard here. 1 mark for the day so far. Chris Salmons hoping he can set on something big here after the 5th box. Wow, what a shot that is. Let's take a closer look at that. Taking a look at the pins, we have the 4, 7, 8, 9, and 10 after a pocket shot. That should have given him so much more. He deserves so much better for that shot. But that's Candlepin for you. Chris Salmons taking out the 4, 7, 8. Almost the 9. 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9. Not so much. He has the 9, 10 with wood. Hopefully getting a 10 off of this. Chris Salmons for the attempt gets it. 10 box for Chris Salmons in the 5th. Putting him at 10 above Bryan after the 5th in the first game. Plenty of bowling to go here, folks. 52 to 42 with Chris Salmons, the home bowler, over Bryan at the half of the first. Bryan Hebert now going to be taking lane 4 here at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Academy Lanes has an impressive amount of lanes. 40 some odd lanes across 3 rooms. We are in the leftmost room, which I am told has been the most recently renovated room in the house. This room in the house is wood lanes, as far as I can tell, as far as I could feel the one time I bowled here. As Bryan gets the spare, look at that. Awesome 6, 9, 10 shot with wood, nails it. Open 52 in the 6th for Bryan Hebert Jr., as I remember to put the hash mark for the spare in the correct bowler's position in the electronic scoreboard. We have CompuScore, manual scoring, and manual resetting at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts here, as Bryan fills with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the 6th box. putting him at 57 after 6. Bryan for the spare attempt. Seems to miss it wide right and looks down as if he encountered another sticky spot. I don't know if that's a problem with his approach or just something he's not too happy with, but one of the two. This is a better block, well, semi-better aim, but still misses wide left for a 5 box for Bryan, putting him at 62 after 7 boxes. And in this Atlantic Candlepin Singles Tour Class D North matchup between Bryan Hebert and Chris Salmons. Bryan Hebert on lane 4, pocket shot. Not so great break, but I wouldn't have done it much differently other than maybe just a mild speed decrease, leaving the 4, 7, and 10 pins at the end with some wood that may or may not help. I wouldn't hit the wood directly. I would go for the left side of the 4 pin if possible. Bryan Hebert trying to get something out of it, hits the wood in the center and gets nothing. Attempting for a 3-ball spare here, aka a 10 box. Bryan takes out the 7 and will take an 8. An 8 in the 8th for Bryan Hebert, leaving him at 70 after 8. Bryan Hebert is 26 and 16 for the season. Currently placed second in Class D Division 4, ahead of Bill Olson and Kevin Martell, and trailing Jonathan Hogan. Chris Salmons, on the other hand, is 22 and 20 for the season, currently placed second in Class D Division 2, ahead of Ray McAllister and Veronica McAllister, as Bryan nails the spare in the 9th. Open 80 after 9 for Bryan Hebert Jr. Chris Salmons is trailing Alex Patton in Class D Division 2 to finish that thought. Bryan on the spare fill, excuse me. Half Worcester plus more, 5 fill, 85 after 9 for Bryan. To reach his average, he's going to have to make some magic here. Hopefully on the spare attempt. Already got those pins, Bryan. Remains at 5. Fighting for hopefully a 10 to get just narrowly under his average. Bryan will settle for an 8, concluding his first game with a 93. Bryan Hebert Jr. concludes game 1 with 93. We are uneven at the moment in terms of the game and match difference. They were 5 pins apart as of the half, where Bryan was up by 5. But Chris Salmons is attempting to reconcile that right now. Chris Salmons' first ball on lane 4 punches right out on the right side. Half Worcester plus a little bit more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Nope, excuse me, just 2 pins. 3 in the 9 pin taken out. Chris Salmons going for the spare attempt. A half Worcester spare is always a very pretty spare. Unfortunately, you couldn't quite nick the head pin in a way that could take everything out in an even spread and a full spread. Chris Salmons going for the 10 box, and it looks like it's going to be settling for an 8 box in the 6th frame of the first game here. We have ourselves a game if Chris Salmons can start some marks up here and have some decent fills, possibly greater than 5. Real quick view of the score here before I switch back to the main view. Chris Salmons' first ball, another half Worcester right side. Wow, very definitive full hit. I think he needs to take the edge off of this ball just a little bit in order to avoid that. Hopefully he doesn't punch through the same hole instead he punches through the left side plus a little more, leaving 4 pins on the deck remaining. 4 horsemen right side plus the 8 pin. Takes out the 8 pin, leaving 75% of the 4 horsemen. 1, 6, 10. 67 after 7 for Chris Salmons. Chris Salmons, headpin shot, makes his mark this time. 7 drop. 5, 9, and 7 pins on the deck. Potentially favorable wood if he hits it right. There's a couple ways to take this shot. It looks like he's going to take it almost the way I was about to mentally suggest it to Chris. Perhaps the telepathy is functional today. Doesn't quite get it though. 5-pin shot, wonderful 3-ball spare. Not a 3-ball spare, just a 10 box because he knocked out a pin in the previous ball. That puts Chris Salmons at 77 after 8, comparatively to Bryan Hebert's 70 after 8. Chris Salmons has taken the lead by this point. Check that out. Wow. Third or fourth half Worcester of the day for Chris Salmons, which is funny because we're in Haverhill. Not quite in Worcester. It's maybe about 45 minutes to an hour drive away. Is he going to punch through the same hole again? That's another half Worcester, another honorary half Worcester for Chris Salmons. Oh boy, the frustration is mounting here. Personally, I think he just needs to get down a little bit lower and throw a little bit slower to avoid another catastrophe, but we are going to be taking an 8-box, salvaging that ninth frame for Chris Salmons, putting him at 85 after 9. We are evenly tied in the 9th for Chris Salmons and Bryan Hebert. Chris Salmons at home defending from Bryan Hebert, the challenger. Both bowlers have already bowled 5 games prior to this one today. Both Chris and Bryan Hebert were in the Lakeside Lanes House Singles Tournament today, along with myself, so all 3 of us have been hanging out all morning and afternoon. Chris Salmons on the spare attempt doesn't quite get it, leaving 3, 6, and 4, I believe. Could be wrong on that. Something about that side I have trouble reading. Chris Salmons on the 10-box attempt doesn't quite get it, concludes with a 9-box. And oh boy, so Chris Salmons has just eked out a win by 1 after the first game. And both bowlers understand that this is quite a matchup. Quite a matchup right here. 94 to 93. Both bowlers bowling somewhat under average today. Chris Salmons averages 93.60 for the season thus far, while Bryan Hebert Jr. averages 100.87 for the season thus far. Chris Salmons is slightly above average. My mistake. But Bryan's bowling a little bit under par at the moment. Bryan with a very pretty shot, very slow motion 8-drop. Could have been a 6-drop, but gets a few extras in the process. Bryan Hebert on the spare attempt. Does he get it? He doesn't. That's a heartbreaking spread of wood that doesn't quite get the 8-pin. Takes out the 7. One of those shots you think would be a gimme, but isn't always in Candlepin. Bryan for the 10 also doesn't get it. Wow, that wood is just not working for him right now. Bryan will take a 9-box in the first frame of the second game. His bowlers are just making sure they enter this correctly on the right side of the manual scoring, on the CompuScore side of things. Bryan Hebert for a second ball looks like he held onto it for a little bit too long and goes wide right, taking out the 6-pin. Here's a view of what he's got. Bryan on the spare attempt, trying to hit the pocket, gets a left side half Worcester to punch out more holes in the array. Hopefully can get something out of this. Better than a 3-box. Is it going to be a 3-box? It's going to be a... Wow. Look at that. It's going to be a 4-box. Oh my goodness. That was a rough box for Bryan Hebert Jr. Bryan Hebert Jr. was down by 1 pin in the first game. Definitely going to have to make some fireworks happen here to catch up and establish an early comforting total lead. That's certainly not going to help. Takes out the 7-pin. That's Bryan attempting to make something out of this here for a spare attempt. Looks like he's going to get 3 more. I was working with Bryan this morning, trying to figure out what he can do to tune his approach. In particular, I've noticed some issues where Bryan will slightly rush his ball. That's a 4-box, by the way, for Bryan. And was this morning observing his throws and running a stopwatch, trying to figure out exactly whether he was going too fast or too slow. And my general consensus, although somewhat unscientific, is that when Bryan throws a ball with a faster approach that takes less time, it tends to fly off course. He's gotten a couple strikes when he averages about 1.5 seconds in his approach, as that's a pretty ball. Bryan will take a 10-box in his 4th for 27 after 4. Would have been nice if that was a spare to salvage some things, but unfortunately, it's been a bit of a struggle here for Bryan Hebert Jr. Bryan attempting his 5th box, working on that. Punches out again, just the 4-pin this time. Unfortunate punch outs for Bryan. Pocket shot for Bryan, attempting the spare, doesn't quite get it. 2, 5, and 7 pins remaining on the deck. Bryan on the 10-box attempt, trying to nick that 2-pin, doesn't quite get it. Will settle for a 7-box in a rather cool 34 after 5 for Bryan. And not quite the half he was looking for. Not quite sure what needs to happen with his approach, but something probably needs to change at this point as Chris Salmons takes the stage at lane 3 at Lakeside Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts. I keep almost wanting to say Pilgrim Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts, but no, it is 2023. Things have changed. Chris takes out everything but the head pin at his second ball. Going for a spare, lofty high ball. I could have told you that was going to go. 10-box for Chris Salmons. As I said before, Chris Salmons has a very unique and rather exciting to me style of approach where he releases sliding on the foot that is the same as his dominant hand, which is somewhat uncommon for a lot of bowlers. That's a pretty ball from Chris Salmons. Right in the pocket, a lofty high floaty ball. Released with your right hand, sliding on your right foot tends to result in a ball like that. The lower you go, the more it's going to go to the left side. Ask me how I know, as I dealt with this all morning, as I have the same approach when I bowl. Chris Salmons with a 3-4 split, trying to get something out of it, takes a 9-box in the second. Not a lot of marks today for the bowlers. Here's a review of the first game in case you missed it. Bryan Hebert had a 2 mark 93, while Chris Salmons had a 1 mark 94, but Chris Salmons still took the game in that first points challenge between the two. In the ACST, if I recall the rules correctly, you can take a maximum of 14 points. That is if you completely shut your opponent out. 2 points per game after 5 games, and then the total amount awards 4 points. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 plus 4, 14 possible points. Chris Salmons on the spare attempt misses the goalposts. 4 and 6 pins. He's going to settle for an 8-box for 27 after 3 for Chris Salmons. Advancing to the 4th box now. Chris Salmons is up by 10 against Bryan at the 3rd. Chris Salmons trying to get something out of this. Going for a bit of a higher first ball, but goes a little bit too much to the right. Probably because his right hand released just a little over the center arrow, which tends to veer off. Again, ask me how I know. Chris Salmons going for the spare attempt. That looks good. Wonderful spare shot by Chris Salmons. Look at that. That was beautiful. Chris Salmons, after 4, open 37 compared to Bryan Hebert's 27. Bryan Hebert's closed 27. Chris Salmons really has an opportunity to turn on the jets and take a lead. And 3, 4, 5, 6. Chris Salmons will fill his spare in the 4th with 6, putting him at 43 after 4. Here's a shot of the split that he has. Let's take a zoomed-in look at this. Chris Salmons for the spare attempt. Is he going to get it? He does. Look at that. Beautiful shot by Chris Salmons for a double spare. And he sits on an open 53 after 5. At this sunny afternoon at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts, October 22nd, 2023. Chris Salmons, the home bowler, currently 22 and 20 for the season in the Atlantic Candlepin Singles Tour Class D North Division, while Bryan Hebert is at 26 and 16. As Bryan Hebert goes for his first ball in lane 4, pretty shot, leaving the 8, 9, and 10 pins. Favorable wood. Looks pretty good to me. He's waiting for the wood to settle. Traditionally, bowlers must wait until the dead wood has settled before they may throw their next ball. This looks good to me. If he can just hit that center wood the right way or the left wood the right way. Takes it. I don't know how that 10 pin went for Bryan, but who cares? It went. It's a good, clean, legal 10, or a good, clean, legal spare, excuse me, for Bryan Hebert in the 6th box. Open 44 after 6 for Bryan. He needs to play some catch-ups for the lack of marks in the first half and those pair of 4 boxes that he had earlier. Bryan on the fill. Pocket shot. 4, 7, 8, and 10. 6 fill for Bryan, putting him at 50 after 6. Possible spare attempt here. Bryan going for it. Almost gets it. That was a good shot. No shame in missing that. That was... I don't know if I would have suggested any other way other than some crazy attempt on the center piece of wood by capping it. Bryan going for the 10, but seems to go for some invisible pins there. Takes a 9 box in the 7th. 59 in 7 for Bryan Hebert. Yes, 59 in 7. Nope, it was totally right all along. I just apparently just read something wrong mentally, but both scoreboards are in sync right now. We have the oldie but goodie CompuScore software manual scoring system at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts versus my rinky-dink Microsoft Excel scoring system. Both score mathematically the same. Just a matter of pressing numbers and symbols to enter the scores, as Bryan takes out 5. In a rather awkward array, taking out another one. 6 down, 4 up. Or 4 up, 6 down. Snoop Dogg joke. Bryan for the 10 attempt. Wow. Gets a little bit gypped on that one. 5 and 9 remaining for the 8 box in the 8th frame. 67 after 8 for Bryan Hebert Jr. Bryan taking a little bit of time here, which is good. Something he's been working on, trying not to rush his approaches too much. Good ball by Bryan. Just slightly misses the pocket. Still gets a decent split. The decks at Academy are somewhat favorable. You don't get as much of a slide as you get in other houses, at least in this room of Academy, as Bryan takes a really nice delayed spare in the 9th box. Open 77 for Bryan Hebert Jr. in the 9th, in the 2nd game of this ACST Class D North match at Academy Lanes. Bryan Hebert Jr. versus Chris Salmons. Bryan Hebert is now working on a spare to fill his 9th box. That looks like that is going to be a 6 drop for Bryan. Bryan is at 83 after 9. This could be a pretty spare opportunity. Let's take a look at this. Almost gets it, hits the object pin, but doesn't quite get the kick he needs to take out the 4 and the 7 pins. Bryan Hebert trying to aim for possibly a 93, gets a little bounce. Good 10 still, just barely on the deck. 93 after 10 for Bryan Hebert Jr. That puts him at a 2-game total of 186 up to this point. We've had a couple of spares, but no strikes thus far today. Both bowlers struggling a little bit to get going here, as Chris Salmons filling his spare from the 5th box with 5. That's going to put him at 58 after 5 for Chris Salmons, as he's attempting another spare here. Object pin hit, but it just dances around, slightly grazes the 8 pin, doesn't really get the favorable shot he's looking for. Chris Salmons for the 10. Doesn't quite get it. 8 box for Chris Salmons. 66 after 6 for Chris Salmons. Up by 11 at this point in the match, compared to Bryan Hebert's 50 after 6. Chris Salmons took the first game by 1 pin. Still somewhat evenly matched. Chris Salmons now punching out the left side with a left side half Worcester, the 2 and the 8 pins out. In the previous game, he was taking out a lot of the right side half Worcester with a 3 and 9 hit. A little too full. That's a head pin shot. Takes out a decent amount of additional pins, leaving the 5, 9, and 10. This is one of those shots where unless you hit the 5 pin just right, you're going to have to settle for possibly a 9 at best, and he does. That's precisely what Chris goes for to pin out this 7th box, putting him at 75 after 7, still maintaining his lead. He just has to get to 94 to take the match and 93 to tie. So he's looking at either 1 point or 2 points if he keeps the current pace. Pocket shot for Chris Salmons leaves all but the 7 and 6 pins. Plenty of favorable wood. Let's take a closer look at that. I'm going to surmise that that was the right kind of shot, and his ball comes back trying to hit the 7 pin. I wouldn't have done any different. I would have just beamed those 2 pieces of wood that were layering over each other in hopes that there would be a spread that was favorable. Almost happens for Chris. Doesn't quite get the left spread that he needs. The ball comes back and attempts to get it, but doesn't quite get there, and he misses the 10-box attempt for a 9-box in the 8th frame of the 2nd game for Chris Salmons. Chris Salmons sits at 84 after 9 compared to Bryan Hebert's 83. We have a game, folks. Pocket shot for Chris Salmons. 8 drop. Very pretty ball. Don't let the Class D North label discourage you. These are good matches that these bowlers put up. It's just the ACST has grown substantially in the past year or so, with a lot more bowlers joining this year, myself included, joining for the first time. And with just a higher quality of bowlers, there's just more divisions and more classes. So don't let the D letter discourage you from watching these matches. These bowlers still put up impressive games. As Chris Salmons just misses the 4-pin for the 10-box attempt, getting a 9 for his 9th box. 93 after 9 for Chris Salmons here. They are tied at this point, so unless Chris Salmons gets a 0 box, he's going to be going home with 2 additional points against Bryan Hebert Jr. Half Worcester plus a little extra. 3-pin drop for Chris Salmons. 7 pins on the deck remain. Chris Salmons attempting the spare. Unfortunately, doesn't really get a whole lot of action and leaves the center column of pins. The 1, the 2, the 5, and the 8. Little zigzag from overhead. Taking out 2 more pins. Chris Salmons takes an 8 and takes game 2. Final totals for the 2nd game are 101 Chris Salmons to Bryan Hebert's 93. Chris Salmons has a 2-game total of 195, plus 9 over Bryan Hebert's 186. As we look to start Game 3 of our 5-game match today here at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts, ACST Class D North, Bryan Hebert versus Chris Salmons. As Bryan starts out with a very slow, methodical 9-drop after hitting the pocket. Plenty of wood for a spare opportunity. Just needs to hit it mostly anywhere to get it, and he gets it. Bryan has taken a spare in the first box of the 3rd game. And we'll scroll up just for some context here. Bryan has taken 2 marks in the previous game and 2 marks in the game before that. So he's on par for at least a 1-mark plus game. Definitely could use a few more as Bryan waits for the pin tubes to come back up before he throws his next ball to fill this spare and gets a rather nasty 4-fill. Wow. Deserved a little bit more than that. I do applaud Bryan taking a little bit more time before throwing his first ball to try to slow down that approach and gain more control over it. Bryan takes out the 7-pin in his spare attempt. Now going for just some additional pins here. Bryan will take a 9-box, leaving only the head pin. So Bryan sits at 23 after 2. With a spare in the first, filling it with 4 here at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Bryan Hebert just slightly missing the head pin once again. Might have been due to the height of his release. I think if he got down a little bit lower, maybe like literally like half an inch lower, he might have hit that head pin. The ball wouldn't have drifted as much. Bryan on the spare attempt, leaving the 1 and the 7 pins. On lane 3, Bryan going for the 10-box attempt. Doesn't quite hit the object pin, but takes a 7 pin. We'll take a 9 box. Bryan sits at 32 after 3. Chris Salmons waiting in the wings after Bryan completes 5 boxes on lane 3, and then Chris Salmons will be up on lane 3. Bryan with a nice controlled ball, maybe a centimeter or 2 off the object pin, leaving the 4 horsemen left side, the 1, 2, 4, 7. Bryan on the spare attempt. Looks like he is... Oh, it looked for a brief moment that he was going to get it. Unfortunately, that has not occurred. Bryan is left with the 1 and the 7. Going for a 10-box attempt. Hits neither. Takes an 8 in the 4th box. Bryan Hebert most recently faced off against Bill Olson, taking a decisive 12 points over Bill Olson's 2. 529 to 493 final match totals, respectively. I also streamed and commentated that match about a week and some change ago, as Bryan already got those pins, takes out the 4, 7, 8, and hits the piece of wood that was once either the 4, 7, or 8, remaining with 3 down, 7 up. Bryan attempting to get something out of this box. Will take 7 in his 5th to sit on a 47 at the half for Bryan Hebert. Bryan has been very consistent today with 93 after 2 games. Excuse me, 93 in game 1, 93 game 2 specifically. Consistently averaging 93. Real easy math there. Don't need a calculator for that. As Chris Salmons starts out on lane 3 with a lofty first ball pocket shot. Oh, beautiful ball. 9 drop, leaving the 10 pin. If you release on your right and slide on your right, the 10 pin is a little bit difficult to hit. You need to throw the ball a little bit higher up. Let's see if Chris will do that. And he does. Wonderful spare by Chris. Single pin spare. 9 drop, 10 pin. Releases exactly as I told him to. He can't hear me because my microphone is really good at picking up quietly speaking vocal frequencies, and this room is loud enough as it is. Chris Salmons on the fill. He hits the 10 pin again, fills it with 1. I know precisely what he did. He didn't get down quite low enough, or he didn't shift himself just enough to the left to be able to hit the pocket to compensate for that drift to the right. Chris Salmons attempting to make something out of this, is going to hit the pocket and gets another spare. Beautiful shot by Chris Salmons. That was a wonderful shot, and he did precisely what I said he should have done, which was release a little bit lower down to prevent that right drift that comes when you release on your right hand and slide on your right foot. Chris Salmons trying to get a better fill this time. He does get a better fill this time, but it isn't a much better fill this time. Fills it with 3. That puts Chris at 24 after 2. Chris hoping he can repeat the ball he just threw. It's looking not so good, leaving the 1, the 2, and the 5 pins left on the deck. Now Chris Salmons fighting for a 10. This could be a 7, 8, 9, or 10, depending on what he hits in this ball. Here it comes. 10 box for Chris Salmons. So Chris Salmons is at 34 after 3. Finally starting to see some marks come together. Just needs to work on the fills, though. Chris Salmons is at 34 after 3 versus Bryan Hebert's 32. Chris Salmons so far successful in shutting out Bryan up to this point, cumulatively. Chris Salmons with a ball that looked promising but drifted just a little bit too much to the left, leaving the 1, 3, 6, and 7 pins. A nice right pocket shot should do this. Chris Salmons attempting that shot a little bit too much to the right, taking out the 3 and the 6 pins, leaving the 1 and 7 pin on the deck for Mr. Christopher Salmons. Chris attempting the 10 box, gets it. Very controlled, focused 10 box for Chris Salmons as he sits at 44 after 4 compared to Bryan Hebert's 40 after 4. These bowlers are very competitive against one another today. The difference in the match is not that high. Either bowler could have a hot streak and definitely take the lead at any point, regardless of what you're seeing in terms of the total right now. but points are awarded per game. And up to this point, Chris has been taking Bryan Hebert to the cleaners in terms of points with a guaranteed 4 at a minimum as Chris gets another spare. Beautiful shot by Chris Salmons. Sits on an open 54 in 5. As Bryan Hebert now takes the floor, this time on lane 4 here at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Roughly about a 30-minute and some change drive from Nashua, New Hampshire, traffic permitting. And Manchester as well, depending on, again, how lucky you get on the traffic. As Bryan Hebert and I also drove down from Manchester just from Lakeside Lanes in Manchester, New Hampshire, from a tournament we were in this morning. Chris was in it as well. The house singles tournament at Lakeside, part of their yearly all-events sequence of tournaments. Bryan bowled a very impressive handicap 691 compared to my 690, so he's basking in that victory as Bryan takes a 10-box. 3-ball spare for Bryan, the Paul Grant special. It's 57 in 6 for Bryan Hebert. Bryan is going to have to get some marks because at this point, Chris Salmons is catching up fast to Bryan's mostly unremarkable first half so far. He did have 1 mark in the first box, filled with 4. Bryan on the spare attempt almost gets it. 1, 2, 4, 7, 9, leaving all but the 4-pin. Bryan on the 10-box attempt gets a bounce. That's going to cause some disruption in the control and the flow of the ball. 9-box for Bryan Hebert Jr. Bryan sits at 66 after 7. At Lakeside Lanes. Not Lakeside Lanes, Academy Lanes in Haverhill. Oh boy. Start a tally for the amount of times I get that wrong today. We're zipping around all kinds of bowling houses today. Bryan and Hebert and myself will be going back to Lakeside Lanes later today for the Sunday Mixed League at Lakeside, which is at 6 p.m. Along with Marta Hebert and Bryan Hebert Sr. Our team's name is Bulldozer, as Bryan takes an 8-box in the 8th. 74 after 8 for Bryan Hebert Jr. Looking to make something happen to get himself over the hump and at least make his average. His average is 100.87. And at 7.4 after 8 boxes, definitely needs at least a mark or more to get that, as Bryan is staring down a 5-drop. 1, 2, 4, 8, and 10 pins by the looks of it. Switch over to this for the spare view. Will he get it? Just narrowly misses the object pin, unfortunately, leaving the 1, the 8, and the 10 pins. Bryan for the 10-box attempt gets 80% of the way there. 8-box for Bryan. 82 after 9 for Bryan Hebert. And at this point, really needs to get something done here. Bryan has remarked that he's had some trouble in this particular room at Academy Lanes from the amateur Candlepin Bowlers Tour this past summer, where we had the finals here. Bryan didn't put up a particularly great showing, and he was disappointed in that. As Bryan goes for the spare and doesn't quite get it, looking at an 8, 9, or 10 box with a maximum of 92 in this game of Bryan, which, unfortunately, that means he's not going to get an under 93, which up to this point, Bryan had bowled a 93 in the first game and a 93 in the second game. Bryan is going to instead settle for 90. 90 after 3 games for Bryan Hebert Jr., unfortunately. Bowling a little bit under par. Bowlers having a little bit of trouble today getting things going. As Chris Salmons is now taking the stage with an open 54 after 5, mind you. So this is a big ball for Chris Salmons. Opportunity to extend his lead. 8-drop, 9-drop, leaving only the 2-pin. Beautiful ball, filling his 5th box with 9. 63 in 5 for Chris Salmons. As he goes for the spare attempt, hits a piece of wood off to the right. Nothing kicks over. Chris Salmons visibly frustrated over that one. Going for the 10 box attempt. Chris Salmons nicks a little piece of wood there, but doesn't quite get it. 9 box for Chris Salmons after 6. Chris Salmons sits at 72 after 6, which means he is on track for potentially a 100 game, which would be 7 pins over his 93.6 average, according to Micah's Excel sheets, out of which he does a fantastic job at being our next-gen stats guy, powered by, I don't know, a computer and a fantastic brain. Chris Salmons for the spare attempt after his first ball. After a rather disappointing first ball, honorable second ball, leaving only the 9 pin on the deck. Chris Salmons trying to pin this out for a potential 82 after 7. And he does. 10 box for Chris Salmons, putting him at 82 after 7. 82 after 7 for Chris Salmons versus 66 after 7 for Bryan Hebert. Chris Salmons on the first ball. Strike attempt. Gets 50% of the way there. 1, 3, 5, 8, and 9 pins remain on the deck. Punch it out right down the center and you'll get it, but only takes out the 8 pin. Misses the head pin by just a little bit. Chris Salmons looking at a 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 box, depending on what he gets here. Chris Salmons will settle for a 6 box as he gutters that ball. Chris Salmons most recently emerged narrowly victorious over Ray McAllister at Academy Lanes, 507 to 471, taking 8 points compared to Ray's 6. So a nearly even split, but Chris Salmons took 2 more than Ray. Bryan Hebert most recently faced off against Bill Olson, taking a decisive 12 points over Bill Olson's 2, 529 to 493, respectively. As Chris Salmons on lane 4 at Academy Lanes punches out the head pin a little bit too full to leave the 2, 4, 7, and 6 pins in his opener for his 9th box. He sits at 88 and 8, hoping to make something out of this. Will he get it? Will he get it? Will he get it? Oh, man. That was a beautiful ball. I was rooting for it. That piece of wood looked like it could have gone. Maybe in a faster house it might have taken it out. Chris Salmons will settle for a 10 box, though. 98 after 9 for Chris Salmons in this 3rd game in this Atlantic Candlepin Singles Tour Class D North match against Bryan Hebert Jr., the away bowler, against Chris Salmons, the home bowler. Chris Salmons is 22 and 20 for the season, just narrowly positive. And there wasn't too much positive about that ball, taking out only the 6 pin. That is known as a lemon drop. The bowlers, wow. Takes out the 1, 8, and 9, which I would say is harder to get than a strike. So Chris Salmons lemon drops his first ball, then takes out 1, 8, and 9, leaving a really awkward array of pins. Hoping to get something out of this. He's going to settle for a 5 box. That still puts him at over 100 for the day. 10 points over his average. Chris Salmons finishes off the 3rd game with another 2 points for himself to take home. 103 to 90 against Bryan Hebert, who's been really struggling these matches. Both bowlers are equally fatigued from the earlier tournament they both just bowled in. So there's not necessarily a disadvantage between the two. Chris Salmons putting up an impressive amount of pins and points against Bryan, considering his average is generally lower than Bryan's. But we move onward and upward to the 4th game here, as Bryan takes the floor once again here on the wood floors, the non-synthetic wood approaches and lanes, I believe, here at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts, in the leftmost room, the red room, which has been just recently renovated. When I bowled in these lanes, I thought they felt great. I was getting a lot of great action here. But the effectiveness of lanes is all subjective down to the bowler. Bryan going for a spare attempt here, doesn't quite get it, leaving just the head pin. Hopefully he can get a 10 box out of this. Piece of wood rolling there. Bryan is attempting to hit the kingpin for a 10 box. And he is going to settle for a 9 box. So here we are. After 3 games, Bryan has bowled a 93, a 93, and a 90. Consistently averaging 92 for the day, which is actually lower than Chris Salmons' standard average. Chris Salmons, on the other hand, has bowled a 94, 101, 103, averaging 99.33. So Chris Salmons is bowling over average, and Bryan Hebert is bowling under average. It's almost as if they've switched places in terms of their seasonal averages, as Bryan will settle for what appears to be a 9.5 box, but will round down to a 9 box. 18 after 2 for Bryan Hebert Jr. Just not quite getting the drops and breaks he's expecting to get. Definitely frustrating. I think he's trying to work out a couple of issues with his approach. I know I've been coaching him a little bit on trying to slow down and more methodically go through the motions of his release. Like that right there, that was a little bit off to the right. Probably should have held onto it for maybe a half second longer. And other factors such as speed, release height, where you start and end on the approach, this all factors into Candlepin bowling. All of these micro adjustments that a bowler often has to make can make a difference between a 100 game and, say, a 150 game. Take, for example, myself. I struggled a lot today in the Lakeside Singles Tournament for a couple of games in which an approach method that I was working on earlier in the earlier games of the tournament was working out really well. I was bowling like 120, 130, and all of a sudden it just dropped off a cliff. And I am guessing it could have had to do with muscle atrophy or some kind of fatigue or something. So for about a game and a half, I tried to adjust it to make it such that I was spinning the ball from a different direction, trying to curve the ball into the pocket from a different perspective. And it worked for a little bit, but then it kind of fell off. And funny enough, through that failure, I learned how to curve the ball just a little bit right, and I went back to the original approach with that one modification to conclude the 5th game with, I think, a 138 or so? I'll have to double check that. It was 130 something. Bryan Hebert, anyways, has a 6 drop here, missing the head pin, hits the 7 pin, leaving the 1, 2, and 10 pins. Bryan for the 10 box attempt here, trying to get something out of it, takes an 8. That is Bryan's 5th box, concluding his first half of the 4th game with 41 after 5. And probably sounding like a broken record, but that's been frustrating for Bryan. His previous halves were in reverse order: 47, 34, and 42. Chris Salmons definitely having a bit of a banner day in terms of points here in the ACST Class D North at Academy Lanes. Chris Salmons opens with a 7 drop, 4-2-10 split. Get down low, get down low. Sorry, Chris. Chris, spare attempt, punches through the middle, and then the 3rd ball veers off to the left. 7 box for Chris Salmons. And his opener for the 4th game. 7 after 1 for Chris Salmons. Chris veers off to the left, but gets some favorable sweep of a piece of wood that bounces off a deck and helicopters over, taking out the back row, leaving with 1, 2, 3, and 6 pins. Beautiful spare by Chris Salmons, nailing that center pin, but just off to the pocket where he could just kick a pin one way and kick the ball the other way. Chris Salmons sits at an open 17 after 2. Chris Salmons on the spare fill attempt. A little bit too full in the pocket, but takes a 6 drop, leaving Chris at 23 after 2. Chris on the spare attempt. Wow, that was not the pin I thought was going to stay up. I thought he was going to take the 2, 4, 7 and leave the 6, but he took the 4, 7, and 6 pin, leaving the 2 after an interesting wood kick, but Chris Salmons takes the 10 box regardless. Doesn't lose any pins on that attempt, at least. Only loses the fill, technically. But hey, 10s are good. 10s are good. 10s are good. Sometimes in tight matches, that's all you need. This has been a somewhat low-scoring match today, or at least an awkwardly inverted scoring match today, where it seems Chris is closer to averaging Bryan's general season average of 100-ish, plus or minus a few, while Bryan seems to be averaging today, which is normally Chris Salmons' season average of 93 and some change, of course, plus or minus a few. Chris Salmons with a 6 drop after 1 ball. 1, 3, 6, and 9 pins remain on the deck. Beautiful ball by Chris Salmons, and mostly got robbed. Excuse me, that was a second ball, and then this third ball. 9 box for Chris Salmons in the 4th. See, this is why we have secondary scoring going on. That way, if I go off on some tangents and forget where I am in time and space, we can easily just find our way back as Chris Salmons punches out to the left side half Worcester, taking out the 2 and the 8 pins. On lane 3 here at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts, Chris Salmons hits the head pin but doesn't get a whole lot to show for it, taking out the 9 and the 10 pins, I believe, awkwardly leaving 5 pins on the deck. Difficult shot to really pin out. Hopefully trying to get something out of this with a spin ball. He's going to have to settle for a 7 box in his 5th. So Chris Salmons is at 49 after 5, compared to Bryan Hebert's 41 after 5. Somewhat low-scoring halves today. But Bryan has an opportunity to make something out of this. Bryan has ceded 6 points to Chris Salmons thus far. Hopefully he can potentially get 4 points and maybe total, which would amount to 8 points, but fortunately not with shots like that. Bryan Hebert has punched out to the right, 3 and 9 pins, and then second ball goes right through that same hole he just punched out. And, wow, third ball punches out the 2 and the 8. That's the full Worcester, ladies and gentlemen. That is going to be a 4 box for Bryan Hebert Jr. Definitely a frustrating ball. Or frustrating box. Even the pros can get those. You can just throw an absolutely beautiful ball and then get a punch out. It could be a left Worcester, it could be a right Worcester, it could be through the center as a spread eagle. Welcome to Candlepin Bowling, folks. Bryan Hebert with the 1, 4, 7, and 10 split connects with the object pin, and will he get it? He gets it. That was a very scary spare for Bryan Hebert Jr. Almost looked like he wasn't going to get it. That pin almost looked like it wasn't going to go down. But the wood negotiated otherwise. Bryan is sitting at an open 55 after 7 boxes. And he's about to fill that open 55 from his 7th with 7. Bryan now sits at 62 after 7 boxes in this 4th game. Really would be helpful if he can get a mark, and he gets it. Awesome job by Bryan. Double spare. Spare with a 7 fill and then another spare to follow it up with, leaving him now at a little more exciting open 72 after 8. Bryan needs to really focus on filling this. And oh! Call that the big LD, the Larry David, the lemon drop. Fills that 8th box spare with 1, putting him at 73 after 8. Second box, wow. 5-pin almost goes completely 45 degrees italicized, but then stands back up, leaving the center diamond. The diamond frequently wins, but the 5-pin is a little off-center, but the first step in beating the diamond is actually hitting the diamond. Bryan will take a 6 box in the 9th. Bryan is at 79 after 9 boxes in this 4th game. Had an opportunity to really catch up with that double spare, but that 1 fill really hurt him. Bryan will take a pocket shot for the 10th box. First ball, leaving, if my visual count is correct, the 5, 8, 9, and 10? No. Ignore me, it's not that. Regardless, Bryan takes 3 of those 4 pins that were standing up on the deck, leaving only the 8 pin. Bryan Hebert for the 10 box attempt. Ball is bouncing around, still rolling, passes in front of the 8 pin. After passing behind it, taking a 9 box, concluding Bryan's 4th game with 88 for a 4-game total of 364 by my account. Bryan Hebert at the half was at 45, while Chris Salmons is presently at a 49.5. Game difference and match difference amounts are a little uneven at the moment because Bryan has completed the 4th game while Chris Salmons is now starting it out. First ball takes out everything but the 1-7-10. This is the WCVB Don Gillis high-low jack shot with some wood. The traditional high-low jack has no wood. Chris Salmons going for it. Misses wide right, doesn't hit any wood. With the high-low jack. Here we go. That's the high-low jack. High-low jack staring him down. Chris Salmons trying to connect with that object pin, but just can't get it. Misses in the same manner that he missed in the second box, leaving the 1-7-10 staring him down. 7 box for Chris Salmons after the 6, which puts him at 56 after 6. Chris Salmons attempting to get something out of this, punches out the left side, plus the 10 pin. 6 pins remaining on the deck, 4 pins down. So it was more than a half Worcester. It was like the half Worcester plus the 5. 1 additional pin taken out after that second ball. Spare attempt failed, 5 pins left on the deck. Here's what the pins look like. Chris hopefully looking to get something out of this. Doesn't quite get there. 6 box for Chris. We are evenly tied at this point in the game. To recall, at the 7th box, Bryan Hebert took a spare and then filled it with 7 to conclude his 7th box with 62, while Chris Salmons took a 6 box, and his pacing is starting to falter a little bit, and they are now tied at this point. A spare would put Chris right back in it. And nearly gets it. Wow, what a... That is a shot that... I swear at one point in my life I would have called that a Leo Lanes shot, but welcome to Academy Lanes, folks. Both of these houses are actually comparable. At least particularly this room of Academy Lanes is comparable to Leo Lanes mostly. Chris going for the 10 attempt, doesn't quite get it, leaving only the 8 pin. We'll take a 9 box in the 8th. Dropping Chris Salmons to 71 in the 8th box versus Bryan Hebert's 73 in the 8th. For, I believe, the first time this match, Chris Salmons appears to be down in a game against Bryan. But plenty of time to reconcile that. 7 drop for Chris as of the 9th box. That is more than Bryan Hebert's 6 in the 9th, so if he can just get 1 or 2 more, he should be in good shape. Doesn't quite get the spare, taking out the 9 and the 10 pins, but leaving the 6 pin for Chris Salmons. Trying his best just to get pins at this point. That's all he really needs to secure those 2 points. Chris will take a 10 box, putting him at 81 in 9, compared to Bryan Hebert's 79 in 9. The gap is closing. Actually, the gap has closed, excuse me. Well, not necessarily. If he gets that closes the gap. He needed a 7 to tie. He now has an 8. He has taken the 4th game. That's another 2 pins in favor of Chris Salmons. 8 drop, leaving the 5 and the 9 pins. Will he get the spare? Yes, he will. For some bonus pins to help him out with the match total, which is increasingly widening between Bryan Hebert and Chris Salmons. Chris Salmons putting up a very impressive day. Normally averages 93.60 for the season, but is averaging something closer to 100 this time around, at least today. Concluding the 4th game, Chris fills it with 5, leaving him at 96 after 10 boxes, concluding the 4th game, to Bryan Hebert's 88 after 4. Here's the scores for, I'll put up both the 3rd and the 4th game here for you to review, and a bit of the 2nd game. So, to review, Bryan has bowled a 93, a 93, a 90, and an 88, compared to Chris Salmons' 94, 101, 103, and 96. 30 pins separate our 2 challengers today. Presently, Bryan Hebert sits at a 4-game total of 364, whereas Chris Salmons sits at a 4-game total of 394, a match difference of 30. 30 pins separate these 2 bowlers, so if a bowler wins by... if Bryan Hebert can win by 30 in this 5th game, or 31 specifically, and maintain pace with whatever Chris Salmons bowls, he can still take 4 points home with him for the total prize. But otherwise, that's about all he's looking at this point. Potential for 6 points for Bryan Hebert Jr. if he could win this last game and take total. Bryan Hebert doesn't quite get the drop he was looking for. He took a 7 box in the first box, but pins it out for a 10 in the second. 17 after 2 for Bryan Hebert. Excuse me, not a 10, a spare. Again, that whole lecture about having 2 scoreboards and 2 different scorekeepers, whether it's automatic or manual, to validate it. Digging through the stats, I was having some trouble just keeping up with Bryan's pacing. Bryan will fill that spare with 7. 7 drop, leaving the 3, 5, and 6 pins on the deck. Almost gets a double spare. Doesn't quite get it, leaving the 5 pin. 24 after 2 for Bryan Hebert Jr. Trying to get the 10 to make it 34, but he'll settle for 33. 9 box. For Bryan Hebert Jr. Bryan Hebert is 26-16 for the season. I mentioned it before, but he's currently placed 2nd in Class D Division 4, ahead of Bill Olson and Kevin Martell, and trailing Jonathan Hogan. Chris Salmons, comparatively, is 22-20 for the season, placed 2nd in Class D Division 2, ahead of Ray McAllister and Veronica McAllister, while trailing Alex Patton. Those stats are likely to get shifted and jumbled a little bit after today's matchup between Bryan and Chris, as Bryan takes a 5 box. I think a little bit of fatigue is settling in at this point for Bryan, as this will have been his 10th game of the day. And Chris's 10th game of the day, really. Like I said before, both bowlers are equally experienced and equally fatigued today in terms of games bowled. Bryan trying to make something out of this. Punched out left, half Worcester left, and then gets a 6-pin lemon drop. Frustrating box for Bryan. 3 so far. Trying to get something out of this. Bryan's going to take a 3 box, unfortunately. Chris has been cheering him on even after that disappointing 41.5, but it's frustrating when you get on a cold streak like that and just can't seem to shake yourself out of it. Some of it is fatigue, though. You know, you try bowling 10 games and then trying to maintain a level of consistency. It is much harder than it looks, especially in Candlepin. Chris Salmons starting out his first box of the final game. Doesn't quite connect with the head pin, but gets a decent amount of backdoor action for 1, 2, and 9. 7 drop. Chris Salmons on the spare attempt. Wide right miss, and I think he knew that too. Probably needed to release that a little bit slower. Chris attempts to get the 10 box, but doesn't quite get it. We'll take a 9 box, leaving only the 9 pin on the deck. Chris Salmons is at 9 after 1 compared to Bryan's 7 after 1. Chris Salmons up to this point has a 4-game total plus 9 of 403 compared to Bryan's 405, but Bryan has bowled 5 boxes. Chris Salmons hits the pocket, leaving the 5, 9, and 10, 5, 6, and 10 pins. Trying to make something out of this. This is going to be a very difficult spare shot for Chris Salmons. Chris is going to opt instead for just pinning it out, takes out the 10 pin, leaving the 5 and 6 goalposts. Punching through the middle does not get you 3. Taking out one of the goalposts will get you 1. 9 box for Chris Salmons. Sitting at 18 after 2 in this 5th game at Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Heard a lot of great things about this house. I've only ever bowled here once. I've heard a lot of things about it, such as a lot of high scores are bowled here, which, depending on which room you're placed in, you're going to get different action and different approaches, different strategies based on the materials of the lanes and how the lanes are graded, how the decks are juiced or not juiced. This room I would probably amount to one of the most traditional of Candlepin bowling rooms, in which it appears everything is traditional wood in here. versus the rightmost room, which is definitively, well, I'll tell you what was definitively that 10 box for Chris Salmons, 28 after 3. But the middle room is the glow bowling room. I believe there is a mix of possibly synthetic approaches, but still wood lanes themselves. And the far right room, the green room, which also has the pub, is definitively synthetic all around. When you throw a ball in that room, you're going to hear the difference. The synthetic kind of sounds like throwing a ball on sheet metal. I don't have super high opinions of synthetic lanes, but it kind of is what it is. It's where, unfortunately, what the bowling industry is kind of trending towards, as synthetic is cheaper than wood to install and maintain, certainly. But having been raised on organic wood lanes most of my life, I just have an affinity for it. As Chris Salmons takes a 7 box in his 4th, putting him at 35 after 4 compared to Bryan Hebert's 38. Some folks really prefer synthetic, though. I know if you bowled out of Park Place lanes, depending on which lanes you bowled in that house, Park Place lanes was a lot like Academy in which some of the lanes were wood and some of the lanes were synthetic. I think at one point they were all wood, but then at some point during a renovation, I think they converted them to, spare for Chris Salmons, to sit on an open 45 and 5 in the 5th game compared to Bryan's closed 41. Park Place lanes had a renovation. Park Place lanes no longer exist today, but when, at some point, I think maybe in the late 90s, 2000s possibly, maybe in the 2000s, they had some form of renovation in which I believe they removed a lot of the wood lanes from their main section and replaced them with synthetic. I hadn't been to Park Place lanes since probably about 2009, 2010, and I remember it was like an ice skating rink there. If you're used to bowling on traditional wood lanes, you might have a bit less of a slide, and you're used to a certain stopping point in your approach. And if you're synthetic, you're probably more used to it being a little slippery, a little slicker, and feeling, I don't know, in my opinion, what feels like an ice rink. But if you are used to that, you're used to that. I was not. The TV lanes at Park Place were still wood, though, at least as far as I remember. The whole house is gone now, so it's kind of 6 in one or half a dozen of the other. Bryan Hebert has an 8 drop, taking out everything but the 9 and 10 with favorable wood. Hopefully he can get a mark out of this to get something, and he gets it. 9-10 spare for Bryan Hebert Jr. In the 7th box, he's at 58, an open 58. Definitely has some work to do. But, as I've said before, and I'll say it again, you still get 5 strikes. Easy game. Easy game. And by easy, I mean totally not easy. Bryan will fill that spare with 4, taking out the right half, a little less than the right half. The right half minus the 5 pin. Bryan will punch out the center, leaving only 75% of the left side 4 horsemen, 2, 4, and 7 pins. As Bryan attempts to make something out of this, we'll take an 8 box, leaving him at 70 after 8. Bryan really struggling this match. Fortunately, that's just how it goes. Also, my apologies, I didn't have the scoreboard scrolled down for the mini viewport. I swear I do that at least once every time I cast a match. Bryan takes a 9 drop. Favorable spare opportunity here on lane 4. The 6 pin with wood. Will he get it? He does. All right, Bryan, good job. Bryan has an open 80 and 9. Bryan has an open 80 and 9. Really needs a big fill, and ideally a strike and another strike and another strike would really keep him in this game. Bryan is going to miss the object pin to the left, taking out 6 plus potentially the 5 pin, but the 5 pin is wiggling and it looks like it's really not going to go. 6 drops so far for Bryan. Going on the spare attempt, doesn't quite get it. Bryan completes the 9th box with 86, potentially 96 if he can get these 2 pins. The 1 and the 5, he's going to get neither, leaving Bryan at 94 in the 5th box. And that puts him at a 5-game total of 458 with potential for, oh boy, might not be taking any points today, pending Chris Salmons' game. Chris Salmons' 5th game. Chris Salmons now attempting to clinch all points in the total as he fills his spare with 3. Spread eagle minus the 9-pin. A really full spread eagle. 5. Oop. A couple extra pins fall there, leaving the 7, 9, and 10 pins for Chris Salmons on the spare attempt. Pieces of the eagle still left on the deck. Really needs to hit that wood in a rather awkward manner to attempt to get that. Let's take a closer look. Almost gets it, leaving only the 10 pin. Chris Salmons will settle for a 9 box in the 6th for 57 in 6. Those 3. As I signal to Chris to confirm that he did indeed throw 3 balls, and that was not a second. It's okay, both me and Bryan both caught it. I signal to him visually. Chris sits at 57 after 6 with that 9 box. Chris narrowly misses the pocket shot to the right, leaving the 4 horsemen left side and the 10 pin. 5 pins to hit. Decent spare opportunity for Chris Salmons. Chris Salmons on the spare attempt takes out the head pin full. 2, 4, 7, and 10 pins remaining. Trying to get a 10 box out of this. Chris will settle for a 9, taking out the 2, 4, 7 pins. Alrighty, so where are we at? We are at the very tail end of this ACST Class D North match against Bryan Hebert and Chris Salmons. Chris Salmons, the home bowler at Academy Lanes here in Haverhill, Massachusetts, successfully defending the house up to this point. Chris Salmons with a 5 drop. Trying to go for some extra pins here with a spare. Takes out everything but the head pin. Looking at a 9 or a 10 box in this 8th box for Chris Salmons. He has officially taken the total, though. So Chris is looking at least 12. No, excuse me. You know what? I will wait till the end before I even attempt to mentally calculate that. Sorry, too many things going on. But he has definitely taken the total. And pending these last 2 boxes, he might have actually taken all points. All 14 available points may have gone to Chris Salmons. But we will find out here momentarily. Someone in the chat smarter than I probably already has figured all this out. And I thank you for that. Chris Salmons on the spare attempt gets really awkward pin spread, the ball colliding with a piece of wood midair to negatively favor the additional spread needed to get to the 3 pin and the 7 pin. Chris Salmons working on a 10 box. Doesn't quite get it. Will settle for 8. Sitting at 84 after 9 for Chris Salmons. This actually may be potential for some points going to Bryan if Chris Salmons is gracious enough to allow for it. But let's see. As Chris glanced back at Bryan rather amusingly. I think he knows about as well as I know that he's definitely got this in the bag now. 9 drop for Chris. That 9 drop puts him at 93 against Bryan's 94. If he can get this pin, either in this ball or the next, he will at least tie for Bryan. If he gets the 10, he'll tie, and Bryan will go home with 1 point. But if he gets a spare and gets anything greater than a 0 on that spare, he will take all points. Chris Salmons takes the spare on a rather awkward 10-pin shot. With a piece of wood, he needs 1 more to take everything from Bryan. Oh boy. Well, here we go. For the complete win, he gets it. 8 drop. 8 drop for Chris Salmons. That puts him at 102 after 5. We now have the full picture, folks. Chris Salmons completes the day for a 5-game total of 496. Taking total by 38, taking all points. 14 points are going to Chris Salmons for Academy Lanes, his home house, with Bryan Hebert taking home a goose egg for Lakeside Lanes. Bryan Hebert, the away bowler. Rather frustrating series of games for Bryan. Both bowlers were equally fatigued after bowling in the Lakeside Singles Tournament today, and that is just what happens in Candlepin. Bryan just had a series of unlucky shots and difficult breaks and things he just couldn't quite follow up on, and hey, that's just what happens sometimes. So unfortunately, that's Candlepin bowling for you. Sometimes Candlepin bowling giveth, and sometimes Candlepin bowling taketh away. Anyways, so that's about it from here in Academy Lanes in Haverhill, Massachusetts. This is the conclusion of the ACST Class D North match between Bryan Hebert and Chris Salmons. Chris Salmons will be going home with 34-20 record, a 34-20 record, while Bryan Hebert is going to be going home with a 26 and, well, I think about that, 26 and 16 plus 14 for the losses. My apologies. Anyways, your final score for the final time today here at Lakeside Academy Lanes is 496, Chris Salmons to Bryan Hebert's 458. Bryan Hebert 93, 93, 90, and 88 versus Chris Salmons' 94, 101, 103, and 96. Thank you very much for watching from all of us here at Academy Lanes and all the staff here at Academy Lanes, the bowlers, myself included, everyone here, and the ACST, bowlers, families, friends alike. Everyone, thank you for watching, and be sure to strike, comment, and subscribe to all the usual places that we stream Candlepin Bowling to, YouTube, Facebook, wherever it is that you get your bowling from, and we will talk to you next time. Have a great one, everyone. Have a great weekend. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.